Part of what this lecture series will hopefully allow us to do is to begin to think more concretely about how we can meet the needs of the diverse populations that are going to be here and that are presently here in the U.S. And thinking about the spirit of 2043 or 2044 or 2040X, whatever you want to call it, whenever we know that this demographic shift is inevitable. This was a place where we could begin to reflect and think about diversity, inclusion, and equity following the events last August that happened on this campus.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Laura Namey. I am the Executive Director of SRCD, the Society for Research in Child Development. SRCD is a diverse, international, and interdisciplinary organization with members from 61 countries. Our core mission is to advance developmental science and promote its use to improve children's lives. We have a growing commitment to using child development research conducted by our over 5,000 members to inform public discourse on important issues relating to children and families. And our focus here today exemplifies this commitment. The increasing diversity of our country, and indeed across the globe, is for many of us an exciting opportunity for growth, broadening our perspectives, and deepening our understanding of human experience. By 2043 or 44, estimates vary, the US will become a majority-minority society, with non-Hispanic whites comprising less than half of our population. By 2020, children will be a majority-minority group, and we've already reached that milestone for infants under the age of 1. SRCD is seeking to lead the conversation at this historic point in our country's history by sharing research on child development that will help children and their families and caretakers prepare for this transition. We envision building on the research evidence to foster positive, inclusive approaches that engender self-respect and respect for others among children and youth of all backgrounds over the course of this transition period. As a result, we are very proud to be announcing and introducing our new SRCD lecture series entitled Child Development in a Diverse Majority. Our plan is to partner annually with a different university to co-sponsor a lecture by a distinguished scholar at the hosting institution doing research work on this critical topic. And we're really, really pleased that all of you are able to join us here today, especially all of the students. I want to acknowledge that this series was very much the brainchild of two amazing individuals within our organization, Dr. Don Witherspoon from Penn State University, current chair of our SRCD Ethnic and Racial Issues Committee, and Dr. Eleanor Seaton from Arizona State, who's the past chair of that committee. We've been inspired by their vision and are grateful that they're able to be here today to witness the fruits of their labor. You'll hear from each of them a little later today when Dr. Witherspoon will be introducing today's speaker and Dr. Seaton will be introducing our panelists. I want to turn now to an acknowledgement of how deeply honored we are to be partnering with the University of Virginia and the Curry School on this, our inaugural lecture in the series. Dr. Robert Pianta, Dean of the Curry School, who's been a leader in his own research informing policy and practice, has been an amazing partner on this endeavor, and we're so thrilled to be in this beautiful place at such a meaningful time. When considering where we might like to launch our series with its message of positive engagement and promotion of respect of self and others, we thought nowhere would be more apt to launch our series with this message, this affirming message than in Charlottesville. After everything this community has been through, we wanted to provide an affirming message. We're so grateful to Dr. Pianta for his receptivity to our speaker and to our speakers and panelists for their willingness to join us in this aspiration. We're hopeful that this lecture will send a powerful message of constructive engagement, looking towards an accepting and inclusive future for our children. So I'm pleased now to invite Dr. Pianta to come up and say a few words about today.
Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to our SRCD colleagues, students in our summer undergraduate research program, faculty colleagues from NCCU, from Curry, and from UVA, our guests from RISE, and to students and colleagues from across grounds in the community. It is a great pleasure to host you and to host this lecture today at the University of Virginia and its Rotunda Dome Room. At this university, since its inception, grounded in a commitment to democracy and civic engagement, this room and building represent the anchoring of Jefferson's experiment in higher education in the placement of knowledge in the form of a library, not a chapel, at the center of the institution. And as we at Curry School, at UVA, and in Charlottesville face into the challenges and opportunities of contemporary education and human development, knowledge must ground our efforts to improve outcomes for all children. And today in the United States and around the globe, this means that our work and our knowledge must encompass the experiences and identities of children across all communities, racial, cultural, and ethnic backgrounds. So it is fitting to partner with SRCD, the preeminent scientific organization focusing on child and human development, to reflect on the implications and opportunities present as the United States transforms to a diverse majority society. I'm delighted that the Society engaged us in their vision for recognizing and celebrating this transformation, and that our faculty can be elevated for the work they do towards those ends, and that we can, in this way, participate in the movement toward greater inclusion. Thank you. And now I'll invite and enjoy Dr. Witherspoon to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Joanna Lee Williams is an associate professor here at the Curry School of Education, a faculty affiliate of the Youth Next, the UVA Center to Promote Effective Youth Development, and a steering committee member of SRCD's Black Caucus. She received her PhD in 2008 in developmental psychology from Temple University. Williams' research focuses on race and ethnicity as social context for youth development. Specifically, her work examines ethnic identity as a form of positive youth development in the face of discrimination and other stressors, and ethnic identity in relation to youth's beliefs and behaviors. She also has applied interest in understanding diversity, peer relations, and positive outcomes in youth development programs, and serves as the Associate Director of Research for the Young Women Leaders Program, a mentoring program for middle school girls. Dr. Williams has authored numerous publications in high-impact outlets, disseminated her work to multiple audiences through appearances in local and national news forums, and received funding from several agencies such as the U.S. Department of Justice to support her research endeavors. In 2014, Dr. Williams was one of 5 young scholars in the country to be awarded the William T. Grant Foundation Award. The grant sponsors a 5-year study of the benefits and challenges of ethnic diversity in middle schools. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joanna Lee Williams.
So let me start by expressing my gratitude. It's an honor to be delivering the inaugural lecture for the new SRCD lecture series on child development in a diverse majority society. I'd like to start by thanking my dean, Bob Pianta, for his ongoing support and encouragement. Thank you to Lauren Namey and Marty Zaslow for the invitation. And thank you to Don Witherspoon and Eleanor Seaton for your active service in the SRCD Ethnic and Racial Issues Committee, and for your role in creating a vision for this lecture series. I also need to share my appreciation for fellow members of the SRCD Black Caucus and the Latino and Asian caucuses, whose leaders have provided clear vision in SRCD during times of change and uncertainty. Here at UVA, I receive great support from my colleagues in YouthNext, the UVA Center to Promote Effective Youth Development, and in the new Center for Race and Public Education in the South. I truly appreciate my graduate students, some of who are here in the back today, who elevate my work tremendously, and I'm thankful to the William T. Grant Foundation for their generous support. Last, today's event would not have been possible without the behind-the-scenes work of Curry staff, especially Diane Cole and Tom Rose, who are in the back. Thanks to you both. All right. Former Secretary of Education John King provided the inspiration for the title of my talk. In 2016, Secretary King gave a speech in Orlando, Florida, not long after the Pulse nightclub shooting. During that speech, he said, "The transformative power of diversity in education is enormous. It boosts empathy and reduces bias and greatly increases the chances that low-income students will attend college without in any way compromising the academic outcomes of their middle-class peers. It exposes students to perspectives and ideas that enlarge their worldviews." In the next half hour, I'll share with you what we know about the transformative power of diversity in education. While there are many kinds of diversity, I'll specifically focus on racial and ethnic diversity in schools. What does research say about how and why bringing students from different racial and ethnic backgrounds together is beneficial? And what gets in the way of realizing those benefits? Before I end, I'll also suggest where I think we need to go in order to fully realize the transformative power of diversity in education. As a starting point, the bar graph on the left shows the population of students in K-12 public schools by race in 1968, 14 years after the famous Brown versus Board of Education decision. For a child entering kindergarten 50 years ago, the large majority of students in schools, about 80%, were white, and the majority of remaining students were Black. The bar on the right shows the population of students in K-12 public schools by race in 2013. For children entering kindergarten 5 years ago, about half of students were white, 1/4 were Hispanic or Latinx, 16% were Black, 5% were Asian American or Pacific Islander, 1% were American Indian or Alaska Native, and 3% identified with more than one race. Moreover, about 9.5% of the 50 million public school students participated in programs to support their development as English learners. Following my remarks, you'll get to hear from my colleague, Dr. Natalia Palacios, about what growth in the population of English learners, particularly from Latino families, means for schools. As you can see from these two bars, as a nation, we've undergone an amazing transformation in a relatively short period of time. So what does the science say about the benefits of diversity? Well, as John King notes in his speech, attending racially integrated schools is indeed associated with improved attitudes towards members of racial and ethnic groups different than your own. It's also associated with college attendance and exposure to new ways of seeing the world. Researchers like Rucker Johnson of UC Berkeley, who've tracked the trajectories of African Americans following that 1954 Brown versus Board of Ed decision, show that Black Americans who attended desegregated schools had a higher probability of graduating from high school. Attending desegregated schools was also connected to earning higher wages and a lower incidence of poverty. But it's not just the Brown generation of African Americans who've benefited from racially integrated and racially diverse schools. Indeed, there's well-documented evidence of the benefits of racial and ethnic school diversity for all youth. Researchers like Amy Stewart Wells and our other panelists today, Dr. Genevieve Siegel-Hawley, in her work with the National Coalition on School Diversity, have published reports on the multiple benefits of attending racially integrated schools. Students who attend such schools have higher average test scores, are more likely to attend college, and more likely to choose to live in integrated neighborhoods as adults. Diverse schools and classrooms help enhance student leadership skills and can create more equitable access to educational resources. Attending a diverse integrated school is also associated with reduced racial bias and stereotypes, reduced racial disparities in educational achievement, and a lower likelihood of dropping out of high school. Catherine Phillips, a professor at Columbia Business School, argues that diverse groups provide more opportunity for innovative thinking. She says, diversity jolts us into cognitive action in ways that homogeneity simply does not. Numerous studies of college students confirm that in the context of diverse groups, students are more likely to engage in creative problem solving and complex thinking. We've long understood that there can be benefits of bringing people from different backgrounds together. In the 1950s, Gordon Allport described his theory of intergroup contact, noting that increased tolerance and reduced prejudice can result when people from different groups come together, but only in the context of 4 conditions: equal group status, common goals, intergroup cooperation, and institutional support. Arguably, schools with racially and ethnically diverse student populations have the potential to create these 4 conditions. And in recent years, scholars have started to examine more closely the specific processes through which the benefits of racial and ethnic diversity are operating. One of the leading researchers in this area, and a mentor of mine, is Sandra Graham, a professor at UCLA. Earlier this year, Dr. Graham published a summary of over 10 years' worth of research she and her team have been doing in diverse public middle schools in California. Their work goes beyond the positive outcomes I described earlier and really tries to understand the processes of why and how school diversity is beneficial to youth. Imagine Mateo, a Mexican-American 7th grader who attends an ethnically diverse middle school. In his school, Mateo will have more opportunities for cross-ethnic friendships than he would if his school were less diverse. While just bringing kids together from different backgrounds in a school does not guarantee that cross-ethnic friendships will occur, a point that I'll return to later, if Mateo does have cross-ethnic friendships, he's more likely to have positive attitudes, beliefs, and acceptance towards racial and ethnic groups other than his own. Indeed, having cross-racial and ethnic friendships is one of the mechanisms through which the benefits of diversity emerge, perhaps because friendships meet many of the important conditions that Gordon Allport theorized about, like equal status, cooperation, and common goals. For Mateo, another benefit of attending his diverse middle school is that exposure to multiple groups will provide opportunities for him to think of himself as being multidimensional. During the middle school years in particular, many youth are starting to explore their identity, reflecting on questions like, who am I? How do others see me? And how do I want others to see me? Peer relationships are an important space for figuring these things out. In diverse schools, kids are more likely to envision their identities as being multidimensional and complex, rather than limiting themselves to stereotypes about their group. For instance, Mateo may see himself as Chicano, an honor roll student, a decent volleyball player, and a member of a group of friends who are all gamers. In contrast, when norms about what kids from particular racial or ethnic backgrounds can do or how they should act are limited or based in narrow stereotypes, young people may restrict their visions for possible selves. For Mateo, having a more complex social identity means he's more likely to have positive attitudes about other racial and ethnic groups, and he's more likely to report better mental well-being. Now imagine that Mateo's diverse middle school has kids from 5 different racial and ethnic groups, and no one group is numerically in the majority. This kind of school provides what Graham and her colleagues refer to as a balance of power between groups. In other words, when there are kids from lots of different groups in a school, no one group has a majority influence. In this diverse setting, Mateo is likely to feel less vulnerable to peer victimization, less lonely, and more safe. Because of this, he's also more likely to have a healthier sense of mental well-being. To summarize, Graham and her team, along with others studying school diversity, show consistently that through exposure to different groups, cross-ethnic friendships, and a more even distribution of power, kids get to know each other in mutual friendships. They build multidimensional identities and feel more safe. These factors help foster more positive beliefs about other racial and ethnic groups and better mental wellness. So now you've heard about the many benefits of racial and ethnic diversity in schools. Indeed, the positive correlates do suggest that John King's belief in the transformative power of diversity is not just hyperbole. Moreover, the work of Sandra Graham and others suggests that these benefits may be maximized through social interactions that foster values around difference. While there is indeed great opportunity in diversity, there are also challenges, misinterpretations, and missed opportunities. The first is a reality. We live in a racially stratified society. The history of this stratification is embedded in the bones of the very building where we stand and sit right now. Thomas Jefferson's rotunda symbolizes his belief in the critical value of education. It was also built by the hands of the people he enslaved. And while Thomas Jefferson gave us the language of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal, which we think of as quintessentially American, he also wrote in his Notes on the State of Virginia that I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. 230 years later, we live in a United States with incredibly rich racial and ethnic diversity, but one in which spaces and opportunities often remain segregated, and forces of structural oppression continue to benefit some groups over others. So what does this look like for our schools? First, while our population continues growing in racial and ethnic diversity, patterns of racial resegregation in schools are actually on the rise. This graph shows the percentage of Black students attending majority white schools in the South from the time of the Brown versus Board of Ed decision in 1954 to 2011. That percentage peaked in 1988. However, in 1991, in Dowell versus the Oklahoma City Board of Ed, the Supreme Court lifted many of its mandates for compliance with school desegregation orders. As you can see, schools in the South have continued to become more segregated since that time. While some have argued that this trend of fewer Black students in historically white schools is due to the fact that schools are becoming more diverse, there's plenty of evidence to show that patterns of racial resegregation are a reality. Of course, the South is not the only region where resegregation of schools is common. In fact, in many school districts across the country, particularly in large urban areas, school districts are highly segregated by race. And when we consider the intersections of race and income, recent data from the US Government Accountability Office shows that the percentage of high poverty schools with high proportions of Black and Latinx students are also on the rise. So school resegregation, often fueled by racially biased lending and housing practices and other forms of systemic oppression, is one of the challenges to realizing the benefits of diversity. That one deals with segregation between schools. But what about segregation that happens within schools? Beverly Tatum opens the 4th chapter of her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?, with the following observation. Walk into any racially mixed high school cafeteria at lunchtime, and you will instantly notice that in the sea of adolescent faces, there is an identifiable group of Black students sitting together. While cross-race friendships are more likely to occur when schools are more diverse, lots of studies show that same-race friendships are quite typical and actually more likely than cross-race friendships. As I mentioned earlier, just because you bring kids from different backgrounds together, this doesn't guarantee they will interact with one another. Sociologists refer to the tendency of people to hang around with others who are like them as homophily. There are multiple reasons for racial homophily in friendships. During middle and high school in particular, being around racially similar others can provide a sense of identity safety and create a context for building a positive racial identity. This is especially meaningful for students of color, since having a sense of racial or ethnic pride can buffer against the negative effects of discrimination that many of them experience in schools. And some studies show that for students of color, being in a diverse school is associated with greater racial discrimination. Eleanor Seaton, who's here today, and her colleagues, along with Sandra Graham and April Benner, have found that when Black and Latino students attend or transition into racially diverse secondary schools, they often report higher levels of discrimination. This may be due to the lack of a critical mass of same-race peers in the school setting and a loss of the positive benefits of racially similar others for identity safety. It may sound contradictory to mention the benefits of same-race friendships after I've just finished describing all of the wonderful benefits of diversity, but it's not. Part of the reason for this is grounded in the realities of racial stratification. Students from historically oppressed racial groups often face barriers that interfere with access to equitable educational opportunities. The social and emotional buffering that can come from having access to same-race peers can be extremely important. So yes, cross and same-race friendships each have benefits. This means that we need to consider if and how schools create opportunities for students to engage in each kind. For instance, the UCLA team found that the greater belonging and safety and lowered vulnerability associated with diverse schools goes away if friendships in the overall student body are very segregated. Although the psychosocial benefits of diverse friendships likely result in part from improved outgroup attitudes, Another question requiring attention is how social and cultural capital bears out in cross-race friendships in diverse schools. In the US, white Americans as a racial group have historically had greater access and opportunity than other racial groups. In schools, white students may have more of the social and cultural capital that is most valued by the school compared to their peers from other racial or ethnic groups. For instance, in my work with Jill Ham, a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, we found that teachers viewed students of color in diverse friend groups with many white friends as having higher levels of social and academic competence compared to students of color in same-race friend groups. On the surface, this seems like a positive. Being in a diverse friend group is associated with positive outcomes. However, it also suggests that students of color who have same-race peer groups, a normative and important setting for identity safety, may be getting unfairly penalized by teachers. In our study, we also found that teachers' perceptions of white students' academic and social competence didn't change based on who the students' friends were, like it did for students of color. Similarly, other studies show that students of color have benefits from cross-race friendships and academic outcomes more so than their white peers. Taken together, these findings reflect the reality that social and cultural capital is not equitably distributed across all kids. This is an ongoing challenge structured into our schools through centuries of systemic oppression, and one that complicates the diversity narrative. Friendship segregation in schools is one mechanism that can affect whether or not attending a diverse school is beneficial. But a more significant barrier to maximizing the benefits of racial and ethnic diversity in schools is what I'll call induced segregation. This refers to the structures created within schools that keep kids apart and result in what researcher Miles Houston calls diversity without contact. For instance, identification for gifted education is greatly influenced by race and income. Black, Latinx, and Native American students are less likely to be identified as gifted compared to their white and Asian peers. Gifted education programs, along with academic tracking, can create diversity without contact and perpetuate disparities in academic opportunities and outcomes. If you bring kids from different racial and ethnic backgrounds together into the same school, but keep them segregated during the school day through racially stratified tracking, then of course the benefits of the diverse student body will never be realized. Amanda Lewis and John Diamond discuss what this looks like up close in their detailed study of Riverview High School, a racially diverse, high-performing public school. It's a school that many families choose to send their kids to because it's so diverse. In their book, Despite the Best Intentions, How Racial Inequality Thrives in Good Schools, they identify tracking and several other mechanisms that illuminate how diversity does not lead to equity. In addition to tracking, one of the other important realities Lewis and Diamond and many others document is that of racial disparities in discipline. Many schools laud the importance of diversity in their mission statements or claim it as a core value, but we need look no further than school discipline data to know that students' diverse ways of being and knowing in school, which are grounded in histories of adaptive culture in the face of structural racism, are not valued equally across racial and ethnic lines. The evidence that Black, Latinx, and Native American students are more likely to be disciplined, including getting suspended or expelled from school compared to their peers, is undeniable. Moreover, many of the infractions leading to discipline are subjective offenses, falling into categories like defiance, disrespect, or disobedience. I often share a story in my courses about an African-American 10th grade teen who I'll call Monica. One day, Monica raised her hand in history class and asked her teacher, "How come the only thing we ever learn about Black people is slavery?" Now, a question like that might catch any teacher off guard, but it's a valid question, one that demonstrates curiosity and careful observation over years of schooling. And perhaps if the question had come from another student who was not Black, it might have been perceived that way. But Monica's question was treated as defiance, disrespect, and disobedience, and she was promptly thrown out of class. When we only embrace a surface-level appreciation of diversity, we say we love seeing students from different groups, but we actually want them to act the same and to conform to standards of the dominant group, then we undermine the value of diversity and instead perpetuate inequality. Monica's question also taps into another way in which we undercut the rich benefits of a culturally diverse student body. In our interviews with middle school students, one of the questions we asked was when and how they learned about race and different racial or ethnic groups in school. Several students say they never learned or talked about race in school, Those who remembered learning something often mentioned their social studies classes as being the one place where race came up. Upon probing, the big picture message they learned about race was that Black people used to be treated poorly, but now things are better. Jasmine, a biracial 7th grader, said, "The main point of history is about segregation between Black and white." Very few students said they learned anything about other racial or ethnic groups beyond the dark history of African Americans, as one student called it. We might chalk this up to being 13. Perhaps students at this age aren't thinking too deeply about academic content. But Stephanie, a Mexican-American 7th grader, was definitely attuned to the messages she was receiving in her history class. She said she learned very little about racial and ethnic minority groups, and when she did, it was one-sided. Specifically, Stephanie said, "There should be other topics that bring up other races. We're just underrated, because it's always just about white people and like war. Like now we're just learning about World War II. And that had like a bit of information about Asians, but that was just like showing their bad side. And you never get to see like what their culture is or any of that. We, Latinos, only come into news when it's about immigration." I asked Stephanie, "What do you feel you've learned about people who are white or European American?" And she said, "That they're more superior than us. They get to seem like they're good, but it's equal. We've all done some bad and some good." In order to maximize the benefits of diversity, we need to carefully consider the messages and narratives students are internalizing, both through formal curriculum and through informal interactions. What the middle school students in our study remembered learning about racial groups was shallow and one-dimensional. They also had little exposure to the kinds of language about racial and ethnic diversity that might support their racial literacy. Many observed race-related social dynamics in the school, but had few tools in their vocabulary box to express and make sense of them. So where do we go from here? I've shared with you the research evidence confirming that racial and ethnic diversity in schools is associated with many positive social and academic benefits for youth. We also know more and more about the mechanisms that support these benefits, which are generally still aligned with Gordon Allport's 1954 theory of intergroup contact. Contact between students from diverse backgrounds will be most effective when there's equal group status, common goals, intergroup cooperation, and institutional support that genuinely values diversity. Unfortunately, as I've also discussed, these ideal contact conditions are not always present in schools, and there are myriad challenges to realizing the benefits of diversity. These include segregation between and within schools, and calling diversity a value on the surface, but engaging in practices that reflect a greater commitment to assimilation. In doing so, we marginalize the cultural wealth of students from non-dominant racial and ethnic groups. So it's important to ask, where do we, as researchers, educators, youth, parents, and policymakers, go from here? First, we must resist and challenge the resegregation of our schools. Very recently, the current Department of Education removed guidelines for school districts on ways of supporting school integration. While the removal of the guidelines does not impact federal or state laws regarding school integration, it does send a message about the value the current administration places on maintaining integrated schools. Several policy scholars have provided evidence-based policy recommendations for maintaining racially and socioeconomically integrated schools. Importantly, these recommendations, as scholar Amy Stewart Wells argues, cannot be race neutral. Claims of neutrality are often used to perpetuate oppression. If race is a central factor in maintaining inequality in schools, then it must play a role in policy making to disrupt the inequality. Second, we must resist and challenge segregation of students and resources within schools. We can never realize the benefits of racial and ethnic diversity in schools if students within those spaces are segregated from each other. While there are many arguments in favor of separating students by ability, we inevitably end up segregating students by race through processes of bias. And we segregate student access to high-quality teaching and learning, since the strongest teachers are often assigned to the most advanced students. This is an area where parents may have more sway than we think. As a parent, I understand the desire to want the best opportunities for our own children. But the high-quality educational experiences we want for our own kids are the same experiences we should want for all kids. Parents can play an important role in dismantling the racialized and academic hierarchies that frequently result from the creation of elite academic spaces. Third, we must resist and challenge xenophobic rhetoric. Just outside of these doors last August, white supremacists marched, bearing torches and spewing venom. They were seemingly motivated by hatred and fear of difference, fear of being replaced. Standing here in the shadow of those recent events brings into sharp focus the fact that we live in a time when rhetoric from people in positions of power fueling anti-immigrant sentiments, xenophobia, and white supremacy is rampant. One of the biggest impediments to realizing the benefits of diversity is fear. Those in positions of influence know this and are capitalizing on it. They argue that diversity can disrupt social cohesion and disintegrate trust. But what research actually shows is that in the context of diversity, the negative impacts only result when there's no intergroup contact. So we all must do our part in resisting the xenophobic rhetoric that preys on our fears of difference. Indeed, for diversity to be beneficial, it requires a steadfast commitment to seeing and valuing others as they are, rather than expecting them to be our mirrors. Catherine Phillips, the Columbia Business School professor, notes that this can be challenging. She writes, "This is how diversity works, by promoting hard work and creativity, by encouraging the consideration of alternatives even before any interpersonal interaction takes place. The pain associated with diversity can be thought of as the pain of exercise. You have to push yourself to grow your muscles. The pain, as the old saw goes, produces the gain. In just the same way, we need diversity in teams, organizations, and society as a whole if we are to change, grow, and innovate." At the end of the day, diversity is important, but it's only one lever for achieving racial equity in schools. Most of the challenges I mentioned that interfere with realizing the benefits of diversity speak to deeper, more entrenched forms of systemic inequality. Whether or not all schools are diverse enough is not always the right question. Instead, we should ask, why do only a limited number of schools provide opportunities for the kinds of high-quality educational experiences we know are beneficial to all kids? So diversity is necessary, and its transformative power in education may indeed be enormous, but a focus on diversity alone will be insufficient if our goal is educational equity. Finally, for scholars who study issues of racial and ethnic diversity in schools, I think we can feel good about what we know so far in terms of the benefits for promoting positive intergroup contact, appreciation of difference, and greater social belonging. Further advancing our understanding of how schools can meet the needs of an increasingly diverse student population will require interdisciplinary perspectives that address the psychological and socio-emotional experience as well as the structural context of schools. Looking ahead, the next question we as researchers need to tackle is, what are the contact conditions needed for promoting equitable outcomes in diverse schools? Thank you. And now we'll have Eleanor Seaton, who will come up to introduce our two panelists.
Good afternoon. As Joanna said, my name is Eleanor Seaton. I'm the previous chair of the Ethnic and Racial Issues Committee of the Society for Research and Child Development. And I have the honor of introducing our distinguished panelists. Natalia Palacios is an associate professor in the Educational Psychology and Applied Developmental Sciences program in the Curry School of Education here at the University of Virginia. She studies the school readiness and academic achievement of children from low-income, minority, or immigrant backgrounds with particular attention to Latino children. Natalia is the co-chair of the Student and Early Career Council for the Society for Research and Child Development. She is also currently serving as the SEC representative to the Governing Council of SRCD. So let's give a hand for Natalia. Genevieve Siegel-Hawley is an associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, and this is a homecoming of sorts for Genevieve because she earned a BA in History and Sociology at the University of Virginia. So this is one of your alums. Dr. Siegel-Hawley's research focuses on examining school segregation and resegregation in U.S. metropolitan areas, along with strategies for promoting inclusive school communities and policy options for a truly integrated society. She teaches courses dealing with racial ethnic relations in U.S. schools, educational policy, and the racial, social, and political context of education. Dr. Siegel-Hawley's current projects include a book manuscript focusing on fostering intentionally diverse and equitable schools, and with her colleagues, a mixed method examination of federally funded magnet schools. Dr. Siegel-Hawley works with the UCLA Civil Rights Project as a research affiliate. She is a Richmond native and a proud graduate of Richmond Public Schools. Dr. Siegel-Hawley taught high school history in Baltimore City Public High Schools for 2 years before returning home to spend 2 more years teaching at John Marshall High School. So let's welcome our distinguished panelists.
I also want to thank our panelists for being here today. They each probably could have done what I just did from their own perspective. So I'm going to ask them to talk for a few minutes each from their area of expertise about what else we need to be thinking about when it comes to issues of school diversity. Natalia, would you like to begin?
Thank you so much for inviting me, Joanna, and SRCD, and to be in the rotunda. It's pretty cool. As the name of the lecture series portends, by mid-century, the demographic changes that are unfolding in our country will make the U.S. a majority-minority country. This change has been driven largely by immigration, with 59 million immigrants arriving in the last 50 years alone, making 14% of the U.S. population today foreign-born, compared to just 5% in the 1960s. As mentioned by Dr. Namey, although Hispanic or Latino immigrants comprise the largest group at 47% of all immigrants in the United States, and those are primarily from Mexico and Central America. By 2055, immigrants from Asian countries are projected to be the largest immigrant group in the U.S., constituting about 38% of all immigrants, with Hispanics or Latinos at 31%. So those are some pretty large and substantial changes, and it's wonderful that we're starting these conversations. What people may not be aware of, although Dr. Williams touched on this, there are classrooms throughout the U.S. today that are, and they're not just in places like New York or Chicago or Miami, where minority children already are the numerical majority in their classrooms. And this has implications for how we train the next generation of scholars, teachers, and school leadership. These demographic changes are not just about the future, as was very eloquently presented and alluded to in the presentation. Certain segments of our U.S. society may perceive these changes as threats to established power structures, and may be why they harken back to the 1950s, when immigrant population was substantially smaller and whiter, more European. You see this reflected in increased negative rhetoric around immigration. You see increased public displays of xenophobia that are normalized. And even in the events that took place in Charlottesville on August 11th and 12th, where those marching on grounds were saying, "You will not replace us." So this is very much about the nature of our changing demography. Recognizing this political landscape is important as we think about serving children and youth in an increasingly diverse country. Unfortunately, there's evidence to suggest that we're failing to help racially and ethnically and linguistically diverse children fulfill their academic potential, in part due to some of the factors that were mentioned in the presentation. So, for example, there are, in my own work, I have found children who are often alone in a classroom working on a worksheet, not being supported necessarily by the teacher because the teacher doesn't necessarily know how to communicate with them effectively, leaving them essentially to teach themselves, which is not what we really expect to be happening in an academic context. Or you see it in the policies surrounding education, with Arizona being a prime example, where bilingual education is touted and espoused, particularly for white middle class populations, as they are available, as bilingual education is available in certain districts, but it is discouraged and essentially not permitted in districts where children are primarily Spanish speakers at home. And so this is reaching to those systematic structural components that you were alluding to in your presentation, specifically impacting immigrant populations. These demographic shifts will require a reimagination or a reimagining of how we train our teachers, as many are unprepared to work with culturally and linguistically diverse populations. We need to help them shift away from a deficit lens to a lens that is more about inclusivity and recognition of students' strengths, recognizing that language diversity may be an asset in the classroom, not necessarily a challenge to be overcome. And for us who are helping create curricula, we need to think and move beyond teaching English proficiency to think about the key intersection between how we teach language and how we teach content. These two things are synergistic and they should be thought of together. In the last year, we have become, and I'm going to shift a little bit away from education just because I think it would be remiss if I didn't mention what has happened in the country with regards to immigration in the last year, but we have become aware of the administration's policy on family separation at the border. And regardless of the political perspective and stand on border security that we may all individually hold, we can say as researchers in an unqualified manner that the type of family separations that are taking place in which young children are being separated from their mothers and or their fathers is harmful to children's development. Toxic stress changes how the brain develops and how children will respond to stress in the long term. Forced separation, along with instability in their physical and emotional situation, has implications for children's attachment, and this will have long-term consequences for their mental health, social functioning, stress reactivity, and ultimately increased mortality. Most problematic is that these effects of trauma will persist after being reunited with parents. And the research that's foundational to these statements has really been done in family separation where that separation is actually out of choice, not under the traumatic circumstances that we are seeing unfold in the border today. As the statement of evidence released by SRCD a few weeks ago indicates, the effects of these policies are felt by U.S. citizen children who perceive threats to their family and safety within the U.S. context. So this isn't just about some other, this is also in fact impacting our U.S. citizenry. And I considered whether I should say what I'm about to say, but I think it's important and fitting. I am an immigrant. I arrived in the United States with my family in the mid-1980s at a different time when the process for getting in line for citizenship was simpler. For children and families today, particularly for children from Central and Latin America, that process can take years and in some cases decades, marked by bureaucratic complexity. My family did not make the decision to leave Colombia lightly, pushed out by social and economic instability and pulled to the United States by the American dream. These are the same push factors driving immigration today, particularly for children arriving at the southern border. Their dreams today are my family's dream from 30 years ago, and I cannot imagine how different my life would be had I been separated from my family at that time. In conclusion, I just want to say that I deeply value my colleagues and for the wonderful presentation that she shared with us all today, and that I generally agree with all the directions that you pointed us in. I would also like to add that we need to work on the diversification of the academy, and this is where SRCD and our institutions of higher learning can play an important leadership role. The research that we've presented here today has been developing over the last quarter century, in part driven by the research interests of racial and ethnic minority scholars in the field. Continuing and expanding opportunities for scholars of color is critical. It's a critical component for broadening our knowledge base and finding solutions to the pressing problems that face us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here for this very powerful interdisciplinary conversation. I think that Joanna's presentation did something beautifully that doesn't often happen, which is to think about and discuss school integration in a holistic way. Often we talk about the first door, how we get kids through the front door together. And we stop there because that's hard enough. But Joanna talked about the first and the second door. So how do we get kids into the same classrooms together too? And I think when we don't think about integration in that holistic way, we run the risk of losing support for the whole enterprise. So I'm appreciative of your efforts in that direction. When I got the guidelines for this conversation, there was some emphasis on being positive, so I'm going to try to have that framing, but these are grim times, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. So I want to highlight some places of opportunity and challenge for education researchers and school stakeholders when it comes to the first and second doors of integration. So when it comes to the first door, getting kids in the same schools together, here are some opportunities that I see in the landscape. The first thing is what Amy Stewart Wells, who her ears are definitely going to be burning today, what she calls metropolitan migrations. And this is the idea that families move in the United States on average every 6 or 7 years. And the movement right now is of white affluent families coming into cities that they had long abandoned at very rapid rates, and a steadier movement of Black, middle, and lower class families into our suburbs. And in those moments of migration, there is at least a temporary opportunity for school and neighborhood diversity and for contact. We are doing very little when it comes to school or housing policy to stabilize those neighborhoods and schools, and we need to be thinking about that. But that's still an opportunity, and I think schools can play a really key role here in terms of holding up diversity as the opportunity that it is, and openly acknowledging the challenges that may come with it. If they do that well, they can help stabilize their neighborhoods. Another opportunity when it comes to the first door is growing public support for school integration, at least on its face. I think over 70% of Americans agree that diverse schools are valuable, according to the 2017 PDK poll, which they'll release the new one in a couple weeks. But that's not nothing. Now, where I think we might differ is on how far we should go to create those diverse schools. But the fact that public support is there, that people want their kids to experience the real world in schools, is something that we should pay attention to. I think the work for us as education researchers is really helping people understand what the cognitive and academic benefits of those diverse schools and classrooms are. They get sort of intrinsically that it's good to have this exposure to the real world, but I don't think they understand the part about going to the gym for your mind that Philip so eloquently puts out there. Another area of opportunity is, the state and local efforts that are flowing from John King's brief but very important leadership on the issue of school diversity. That was hopeful too. It was the first time in 40 years that the federal government had used the bully pulpit, that's not right, pulpit, not the bullpen, that's weird. To hold up diverse schools as something we should be working towards. And he did that in part because of the work of researchers and advocates and the media, in particular Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times, in terms of lifting up the issue. And they wanted more research. They wanted more research on why this matters for child development and outcomes. I think we need more research on school choice in a contemporary context. School choice in some forms further stratifies families, but it has been used to further diversity, and we need to really understand what matters when it comes to choice and diversity. I think the direction of the court is going to mean that we need to pay close attention to those voluntary efforts. One area here, I think magnets continue to be funded by the federal government. They actually saw an increase in funding, and I think really prioritizing the creation of dual language magnets is an element for bringing kids together under all ports conditions that has been unexplored when it comes to the integration side of things. Okay, for the second door, what do you need to do when the kids come into the same schools together? We have a very clear need for much stronger teacher and leadership preparation. When it comes to diversity, we can't continue to siphon off the linguistic or racial or equity diversity issues into one course if it's offered at all. And I think some key topics for courses and for contemporary research would be helping teachers and leaders understand how to best structure diverse schools, thinking about detracking, for instance, helping them understand how to best structure diverse classrooms, what sorts of cooperative grouping mechanisms could they be using to usher all ports conditions into the classrooms, where are the opportunities for social and emotional learning, et cetera. They need guidance on how to talk about race and difference in schools, and they need guidance on how to equitably lead diverse schools. Racial change is destabilizing and unnerving for the vast majority of our educators, 80% of whom are white and who went to segregated white schools themselves. Unequal treatment often flows from those things. We need a more diverse teacher pipeline. We need research on creative ways to engage families in schools. We forget that all ports conditions matter there too, in diverse schools. I think an area of hope here is that racial change does produce the contact that is the foundation for the social dimension of school integration. And I think that the state and local focus on more equitable student discipline is a positive, even if the federal government is going to at least temporarily retreat from leadership on that issue. An area that gives me hope is that the accountability pendulum appears to be swinging just a little bit away from a laser-like focus on standardized testing as the only outcome that we're going to measure for schools that has stigmatized and harmed teaching and learning in segregated schools in particular. And I think finally, in schools that are diverse, we can't forget about the civic education that needs to happen there. These are the places where kids learn to participate in an increasingly diverse democracy, and we don't give them the tools that they need for learning in our schools right now. So thank you.
I want to thank our speaker and discussants for sharing your important work and your compelling insights and your thoughtful and your impactful advice on how we should move forward. I can't thank you enough for launching us with such a beautiful array of perspectives and information. I want to once again thank the Curry School for hosting us and for partnering with us on this. And I want to thank all of you for being here and for being part of the conversation. I just wanted to remind you that we do have hosted by UVA, a light reception downstairs on the first floor in the lower west oval room. Thank you all so much for being here.